In the first extract here, we see Silk as judgmental but also humorous. Notice that it's not written directly from Silk's perspective, but it's that limited perspective that Grenville uses. The first little part there where he describes, or rather Grenville describes the colony as quieter and stupider than he had feared. These are the judgmental words that Silk would use. They're not the sort of words that Rook would use to describe the colony itself. Unlike the use of, say, mathematical language and things like that, Silk is, I suppose, a little bit more analytical. He's a writer, and he is more inclined to be judgmental using those sort of words, which is not a typical thing you wouldn't think for an officer in the British in the British Navy. Further on there, you can see that the information that he's clearly been educated in is something he thinks was a waste of his time, but he uses a sort of humorous phrasing, which is information that he would just as soon have gone to the grave without. You can hear this voice of Silk in the narrative, but it's not him. It's still that limited perspective and that narrative styling that Grenville likes to use. When you're writing from Silk's perspective, these are the kind of things that you can do. If you can make your writing sound slightly humorous, or even insert those sort of judgmental words, remember, not all the time, but just sort of fold it in to make sure that that voice of Silk is articulated sort of clearly, and we know that it's him. By the way, this is from page 192. So an activity to contribute this is to place these judgmental words into a brainstorm. You can see here that these are words that someone like Silk might use if he was judging a scenario or a person. Words like annoying, ridiculous and outrage, they're words that Silk would use, certainly not words that Rook would use. Of course, they have to apply to whatever the scenario is so that it seems authentic, and it may well be worth, just as a little activity, brainstorming a variety of these words that you'll be able to use in your own creative pieces. In doing so, also, you'll be able to speak about why you chose those words in your statement of intention, referring back to how you were trying to create a unique character, or not a unique character, but how you were trying to emulate the character of Silk himself. So this section shows something similar, but it's directly his dialogue. So you can hear the facetious, humorous tone in him telling Rook about what had come from home. This year's crop of wheat and barley to yield 400 bushels. Have you ever heard anything so scintillating? So he's sort of making fun of the information that's come to him. Even at the beginning of that dialogue, he says to Rook, "You'd better sit down." Now, in saying so, it's as if this information would knock him off his perch. Of course, it's not going to, but he's using it to sort of seem humorous. If you follow this line of dialogue down the page, you can see that he sort of is judgmental again when he says that this place has its charms in spite of its dullness. That criticism, I suppose, is uniquely Silk, and I think when you place your own dialogue in, particularly if Silk is talking down to somebody or somebody on his level, he would speak like this in a critical sort of way. So, you know, that sort of phrasing is something that you should fold in. I would sort of warn you against doing that if he's ever in the company of the governor or someone like that, if that's part of your narrative, because he would still fall into line and be extremely respectful. He is an officer, he is a man of the Navy, so he knows sort of when to speak in a facetious manner and when to speak in a respectful manner. Okay, this one's a little bit tougher and definitely a good idea to use your friends and teachers to get these kind of phrases. You would have noticed in the example that it was about, that are you sitting down, because he's going to come up with some shock information. Other phrases like that are worth sort of compiling, and they might fit into your own creative piece. Suggestions from my students were brace yourself and buckle up would be versions of the one from the example. But there's lots of these lead-in phrases that sort of show that Silk is a guy who likes to think of himself as funny, or wants to be sort of, the interesting, clever guy in the room. Good luck. In addition to his sort of humorous, joking, facetious nature, Silk is an author, remembering his primary motive for being on this trip is really to write a story about being in a foreign place and make it exciting. We begin to dislike Silk because he effectively sees an opportunity to manipulate Rook late in the story, where he sort of tries to take his own study away from him. But also remember that Silk is a man of strategies, and he is a man of the military. My thinking is he's a writer, and he's probably well read. He's a little bit different to many of the other officers. In this little passage, which comes from 263, he in fact says, or the description of him is that he was able to put in a plan that was perfectly executed. And it was as if it was from a military textbook. As a character, we can see here that he is a competent officer. He can lead people, and he's probably pretty well read around things. So my advice here is, if you wanted to borrow some of this strategy, you'd be able to talk in sort of military terms, well-planned terms, and you'd be able to even use sort of Navy rhetoric, like tack and sail and things like that. The final thing to say is, as a writer, if he's a writer and a reader, anything around writing and reading, pens, scribing, books, binding, those sort of things, if you wanted to borrow that thread because it fits with Silk's character, that might well be a good strategy to take on too. This activity is about you accessing the kind of language that an officer class guy would use. You can see that on the left-hand side, I've tried to use sort of naval sort of language like tack, mutiny and regiment, or the military terms around the outside for insubordination, obey, serve. There's a whole list of these words. If you type into any sort of search engine, naval, military language, these sort of words will come up. Remember not to over milk these sort of words, but try to create them so that you can sort of fold them into your own narrative about how an officer of the British Navy would speak, particularly if he was speaking to a superior, or if he was speaking to someone below him, or even if he was trying to describe an event or something that had happened in that omission that you're delivering.